Good afternoon to people in Europe. Good something else part of the day to people in Canada or elsewhere. I'm Peter Handley. I'm from the European Commission's DG GROW, looking after energy-intensive industries and raw materials. And this is the last panel of the session that we've set up about traceability throughout the battery value chain. And I'd like to have a discussion with the panelists after I've introduced them. So they are Miriam Elkara, Supply Chain Manager from Vercor. I see you there. I think we've spoken in the past, actually. Yves Noël, Vice President and Chief Business Development Officer from Lithium Recycling.
Hello, Peter.
Hi. Michael Insulan, Vice President from First Cobalt. Chris Dornbos, CEO from E3 Metals Corp. And sitting in the same room with me, actually, Bernd Schaefer, CEO of EIT Raw Materials, which is running our European Raw Materials Alliance, and online, our other industrial alliance, Diego Pavia, who's the CEO of EIT Energy, which runs the European Batteries Alliance. So welcome, all of you. There have been sessions earlier this afternoon, which you've probably not followed any more than I have. But the key questions here, I think, are what do you think is the role of traceability in establishing a sustainable battery value chain? I'm going to just throw that one out there and say, no essays, just 1 or 2 minutes, sound bites. What do you think the answer is? What's the role of traceability in establishing a sustainable battery value chain? I'm going to ask the sort of entrepreneurs among you first. Michael, do you want to take that one?
I was hoping you wouldn't get to me first. We take just, as a quick introduction, Electra, the battery I represent here, is going to build the objective is to build 4-phased battery materials park in Canada, which does include recycling, which has been a very hot topic over the past few panels. And in terms of traceability, we take a very sort of pragmatic approach to this. We have already secured for our cobalt, the raw material supply. We have secured 5-year terms of 2 specific mines. It will come straight to our plant, packed and tagged and sealed. Now, of course, we do think about where this material will end up after it goes through our battery materials park, because ultimately, since we have a recycling asset as well, we would like it to come back to us so that we can recycle it and make new material. I know there's a lot of initiatives, and we really applaud these initiatives, but we are really, down to earth, back to basics company that just try to do the recycling and do the battery materials production. And traceability, we essentially do the back to basics way. We know where the material comes from, and we very much know where the material goes.
Okay. Now, Miriam, you're in a sort of fairly young company. How do you see the role of traceability in what you're trying to do?
Well, indeed, young company building the supply chain. So for us, it's a matter of complying with regulation, but also what our customers' needs are. So trickling down the supply chain is a matter of clarifying what our standards are for sustainability, what we pick for ourselves to apply as standards and for our supply chain actors. And it's not anymore a speech of comply or explain. It's just comply. So it's a matter of checking and having some kind of transparency. Of course, we can't check for everything. So it's also a matter of accompanying the change and accompanying the actors in the supply chain to come at par with the standards.
Yeah, I think we've got one other lithium player in the room, right? So let's hear from Yves. Are you telling the same story about the role of traceability?
Well, thank you, Peter, and good afternoon to everybody there. I mean, we are active in the lithium-ion battery recycling as well as cell manufacturing production waste. So we kind of sit in between old battery and production waste that needs to be recycled, and we we create and we manufacture battery materials or battery metals with them that go back in battery. So for us, traceability there is at the heart of our development. It's sure that we cannot confirm the source of the batteries that we receive for recycling, but what we will do with traceability there is to enable our materials to be qualified as recycled, and also there to make sure that the carbon footprint of the recycling process that we have developed will be as low as possible. So that's how we see our role in traceability. I mean, generally speaking there, we see that as a very good initiative from the industry, and we will participate into it, definitely.
Okay, now we've talked lithium, lithium, lithium. If there's one battery raw material which is crying out for traceability, it has to be cobalt. We all know that a lot of this cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and you've got an official sector and you've got an unofficial sector, and the trading is not always the most transparent. So a question really, obviously to you, Michael, how are you confronting this challenge and the multiplicity of different schemes for kind of tracking what's coming out of the DRC?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. We're a relatively small company. We're actually pre-production. We will start producing at the end of next year. Given that we're a small company, we don't really have the bandwidth to enter into every single program there is out there to really do the initiatives relating to fair cobalt and monitoring on site on a continuous basis right now. So we took a very pragmatic approach, and we selected 3 companies from which we decided that they comply with all the regulations, that they do not engage in child labor, and importantly, that they engage with the local communities, they build schools, they are pragmatic in the DRC and help develop that country. Those were the criteria that we went by, and we do have long-term supply agreements with these companies. We will not buy cobalt from anywhere else but these 2 specific sources that we have contracts with. That's the way we've solved it. Now, it's a massive challenge, of course, because a lot of people in the DRC depend on, livelihood depends on mining. So there are initiatives, of course, like the Fair Cobalt Alliance, like the Responsible Minerals Initiative, and many others that try to solve this and really support the communities in the DRC. That's the way I would explain it, Peter.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for that. Now, Chris, you describe yourself as a serial entrepreneur, which I guess is a good thing. I mean, there are other things that go after serial which are not quite so good, but I guess you're screening a whole range of business opportunities, and to what extent does the ability to track and trace influence your investment decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I'm the CEO of E3, but today, I've been asked to join this panel as because I'm also director of the Battery Metals Association of Canada. So I'm going to try to come at it from that lens and not be too biased against my E3 side, but we did panel or query our membership, and I think one of the big things that came out of that query was what are we tracing? And the question of traceability is obviously important and how we do it, but what are the metrics that we want to have? So, for example, do we create a scorecard that becomes a standardized thing for products going to these batteries that allows you to check things like the source location? It's some sort of metric on its ESG, whether that's a carbon intensity or some score against its impacts. These are the types of things that we've been seeing as important. And I think what it really comes down to is that in the future, everyone agreed from the discussion that we've had here in Canada on our end is that traceability is going to be a thing that's going to be required. I don't think anyone's arguing that we're going to have to be able to understand where these materials are coming from. It's more how you do it and what your benchmark is to that traceability.
I'm going to stick with you a minute because you have another hat. You're involved in the standardization activities. We all know that last year China proposed successfully to set up an ISO committee on the lithium for batteries and their recycling. So to what extent in the international standardization process is there attention being paid to the role of traceability?
Well, I'm on, that's right. I'm on the shadow committee for TC 333, which is the lithium ISO lithium committee. And, you know, traceability is something that's been discussed. Unfortunately, the conversation is just getting started. Like the work plan is just written. It is moving quickly, but it's a fairly new panel. So there's nothing definitive that's been discussed on traceability other than the fact that if you're going to have a standard, you have to have a way to measure against these things, and that requires traceability throughout the whole process. And you know, it's a challenge because it has to be. It is, and this is the conversation that comes up with the ISO all the time. Is what becomes part of the piece that you're working on and what should be another standard. And so maybe there should be a traceability standard so that you can just enact that standard to say here's how you rate, here's how you self-rate, or here's how you independently rate your material and the metrics you need for traceability. So the conversation's there. Everyone is discussing that it's required, but unfortunately it's still pretty new. So there's been no real movement. So it's sort of a non-answer. I apologize for that. But
well, no, but you said an interesting point that maybe there should be a horizontal approach on how to do traceability in the standardization world. Now,
well, it's just like, sorry, as you say, it's just like carbon emissions. There's no carbon emissions standard in the lithium standard, but they relate to the emissions standard, ISO standard for emissions. So that's the type of sort of path that this will likely take for the TC 333.
Yeah. Now I'm going to turn to the two European industrial alliances we have here, both of which bring together a wide range of companies across the value chain, and which are also open to companies outside of the European Union. It's obviously a good place to start on a batteries workshop to ask the European Batteries Alliance. So Diego, to what extent are you looking at the ability to track and trace when you're looking at companies that wish to join your alliance or which present investment proposals to you?
Yeah, so three things, Peter, and good afternoon to everybody. The first message is not so nice to have, is a business requirement from the off-takers. I mean, today, if you talk to the big off-takers, the OEMs, they want to know the battery they can install and integrate in their cars, what is inside it. So it's not that, hey, it would be nice to have traceability. They're requesting this. Otherwise, they will not buy your batteries. That's very important. Number two message is, hey, the regulation that was crafted last year in Europe, that is for me, an early mover into the whole thing, puts traceability at the heart and is an enabler. I think that is the right direction and the right milestones to fulfill. And again, the off-takers of batteries in Europe, they're happy with where it's going. And the third, to your question about our investments. So I've invested around like 40 plus across all the value chain from mines to recycling. And the third, fourth question we ask is, hey, have you put into the design of your activities how you're going to track, store, and value the data for afterwards serving the traceability? Because if not, then you are off target, because nobody will be willing either to buy your battery or your active material or your raw material or your recycled material. And it's coming step by step. It was not 1 year ago, but now it's more and more in the learning curve.
Yeah. And now I'm going to turn to you, Bernd. It's really the same question. I mean, you also have a large constituency of companies that are members. And to what extent are you looking at traceability?
Traceability, yeah, we are looking at this, of course, and traceability is key in our organization when we are looking at the projects that we are supporting here. It's certainly key for a future-oriented raw materials sourcing policy and also responsible, compliant supply chain management from extraction to mining, manufacturing, through the use phase up to the end of life cycle. And so it creates the basis for establishing traceability mechanisms. And we have in our organization relevant partners along the entire value chain here. And certainly we are well positioned to facilitate also data collection. So we have a couple of projects here, like startups that we have been supporting in projects that help to create transparent and reliable tracing of raw materials within the value chain, and also using innovative blockchain technology. So we have startups here like MindSpider or Circularise, where data is key to traceability, and data needs, of course, context, and that must come from experts. We are here to promote those experts and making sure that we create the necessary data transparency.
It's very weird talking to you, Ben, because we're tempted to look eye to each other, but then we're not looking in the camera.
Exactly, that's why I'm trying to look down here, so it's not...
Now, earlier this year, there was a lot of discussion in the G7 about supply chain resilience, and part of that discussion was that maybe we're moving gradually away from just looking at the value being linked to the product towards the value proposition being a combination of product and accompanying data that goes with that product. So you actually get a service package. And maybe at some point in the future, it's the value of the data that travels that can be become a more interesting part of the value chain. We picked that idea up a little bit in our strategic dependencies analysis in May this year. So again, I throw this out. Is this traceability just a question of reassuring the off-takers and the end consumers, or is there some business value in this stuff? I don't know. I'm going to just pick one at random. A lady, maybe. Hey, Miriam.
Indeed, for Verkor, the digitization of the whole process, the whole manufacturing process is very important. And I keep hearing our digitization team saying the data needs to flow. So actually, as soon as a raw material product or a semi-finished product hits our production plant, it needs to be scanned, and all the data needs to flow throughout and inform the processes, but also the end customers, as Diego was saying, on the content. So there is, in the sheer way things are being built, there is value in having this data as a packaged deal with the product. And whether the data in and of itself will become of value, yes, depends what we want to do with it. Is it somehow a pool that will allow to improve processes? I believe so. Is it a feedback loop that will allow to direct investments and direct loopholes in the value chains? I think so too. Yeah.
Just another reference point is that we had the G20 side meeting organized by President Biden at the end of October, and one of the things he was putting on the table was that there's really a lack of transparency, generally speaking, in many of these raw material global supply chains, and looking at various ways where like-minded countries can work together to improve this transparency. So clearly, traceability, labeling, and similar kinds of tools can open up a little bit of this transparency. What do you think of that notion? Anyone want to jump in on that one?
Well, maybe a quick answer, Peter. So we have let pass in Europe, downtown Europe, 3 cases because the investee would not commit to traceability. Not on the mining side, because all the juniors that are coming here from Australia, they are, but on the recycling. So as Europeans, we have to be very mindful that in end of life, not in a scrap recycling, but end of life recycling, again, we have passed 3 actors that they didn't want to play ball in traceability. So we let it pass. So I think that we, the investors guys, we will crowd out those that will not play ball.
What about the others? Do you think the market's going to shift in favor of those who are playing the transparency game?
Well, I think for me, it will be a must in the future. I mean, if you want to be in that arena there, I mean, the industry is going there. Legislation is there favoring the traceability. It's a more of a pull from the consumer, from the clients. So for us, we see it as a must to build a sustainable business.
I would just maybe like to comment as well, Michael, here. You know, I think as a producer, there's one major thing here. We are perfectly committed to traceability, and we will abide by the rules and guidelines and regulations given to us by authorities or our clients. Essentially, the people we want to sell to, they have certain rules that we have to follow, and that's the OEMs and the cell makers, and they're very strict on these things. But I would like to ask the sort of community of rule setters that are doing a very important job, not to make it too cumbersome, to do the reporting and to engage on a transparent basis, because many of these companies are quite small, and many of them are new entrants to the industry. And it has to be, of course, transparent and robust, but also has to be relatively simple to actually engage in a transparent way. Those are my 2 cents on that matter.
No, I agree with you. I've had a number of conversations with companies, some of them who are speaking in other sessions today, and I think you cannot impose this kind of certification on let's say an African country that may not have the capacity or understand the reason why we want to do this stuff. So you have to get the buy-in at the mine level, right? And I think you have to get the local management to see that there's a value in this stuff from the very beginning. So there's a lot of narrative and explaining why it's worth doing, I think, which you have to invest in at the beginning. Any of you got any experience of actually doing that, talking to the mines in developing countries? No one?
Well, we do talk to mines in developing countries, but they are very well-established mines, and they are very big miners. So, of course, they're up to speed on exactly what needs to be done.
Yeah, yeah. And the European Union is proposing a thing called a digital product passport. Does that concept come across clearly, let's say, in other parts of the world, do you think? And is it something that's going to be easy to implement? Anyone got a reaction on that one?
Yeah, well, I can jump for 30 seconds. And link to the question you put to Miriam on the value, whether data will be a value besides the resource. So without saying names, because I guess that we're not allowed to say names here. So one of our big investments, they just closed in the summer, post-money, 11.5 billion in Europe, Northern Europe. And those guys are fully integrated from active materials to recycling. And when asking the big investors how they build the value up to 11.5 billion, then 25% was based on the data model of those guys. Mm-hmm. So data is value. At least in the perception on the guys that put this summer 2.5 billion in the last round of those guys.
Yeah. That goes back indeed to what we were discussing a little bit earlier. Yeah. Now there's a lot of initiatives out there. They've been developing a little bit piecemeal. Some have been NGO driven, others have been industry driven. How does it all hang together? Is it clear to people? Is it confusing? And is it enough to leave all these voluntary or industry driven initiatives to happen? Or do we need some way of sort of gluing it all together?
I can maybe jump to start on that one. Everything's really immature in the EV battery space right now. Everything it's a massively growing market on all levels, whether it's the raw materials like Michael and ourselves at E3, or even the battery manufacturing, and so the whole value chain is new. At the end of the day, it's going to have to be standardized. So it's going to have to likely be regulated through some standard organization, and that's probably driven largely by the end user, I would say. So if an automobile company needs to be able to determine the precise metric so that to understand the tax regime that they're going to be taxed at, or that sort of information, that's, let's say, one driver, they're going to demand down that chain everybody provide that information to them. And I think in the future it will be standardized. But right now I think it's just there's so many new things popping up all of the time, that it's just going to take time. It's just immature, and it is growing very fast, so it's hard to keep track of it all. But yeah, it is something that I think will at the end of the day be and needs to be transparent. I think it's be hard for this industry, the way that, especially in Europe, and I think that this is going to be seen in Canada and maybe even the United States as well. We were talking yesterday about Canada's carbon tax and what that does to potential prices of commodities. The Prime Minister of Canada was talking about it yesterday, and it is something that if you're going to have a more expensive product because you have a lower carbon footprint because you pay a carbon tax or whatever that case might be, you'd want to be able to put a stamp on that and say that it is a lower carbon product and that it demands that price, because you're not going to be able to sell it for, you're not going to be able to undercut your competition because you've built a big carbon neutral facility that's cost you a lot more money because you're avoiding paying a carbon tax. So I do think that in the long run, yeah, all of these things will need to be a selling point for everybody from all ends of the value chain to say this is truly a carbon neutral, or truly from a jurisdiction that and has the right sort of ethical mining procedures applied to, or whatever the case might be.
Yeah, I was going to come on to that a little bit, throw this one out. So what kind of things should certification systems be looking to address? I mean, should it be everything? Should it be kind of like quite constrained? Because you could say, I want a certification system that tells me there's no forced labor going into this at any point in the value chain. Or you might be wanting to know about pollutants, not greenhouse gases, but also any other environmental things. So does it make sense for a certification system to be trying to give assurances about everything? Or do you need something which is the right kind of shoes for the right kind of feet? How do you deal with this fit for purposeness? Let's ask Yves.
Yeah, well, thank you there. Well, I think it's part of the standardization that Chris mentioned there. I mean, if we try to track everything, then it's going to take more time, more resources there, and there will not be any convergence of the industry. So again, it's part to me of, let's make sure that the real, I would say, drivers there, the OEMs and the people there, that done all together, and all the actors along the value chain there. And it's a huge value chain with many players and diverse in geography. So it will need that consensus, that coordination among all the players of the ecosystem there. And my message here is, no, we don't need to measure everything. We just need to measure the right parameters there, and that still need to be determined.
And probably you also need a kind of conversation between the supplying end and the consuming end, because there needs to be some. It's a bit like measuring life cycle impacts, isn't it? You can't just unilaterally decide how you're going to do it without having a conversation with the other players in the supply chain.
Correct.
I'm going to just turn to Bernd now. Now, Bernd's Raw Materials Alliance has just come out with an action plan on the rare earths and permanent magnets value chain. Now, we know that traceability is going to be a very important part of this, because a lot of it comes from China, a lot of it comes out of Myanmar, a lot of it comes out of regions where you're not quite sure what's going on. So over to you, Ben. To what extent is traceability a factor in what you think needs to be done as part of building a resilient European value chain for rare earths and permanent magnets?
Well, regarding to the rare earth permanent magnets market, it's certainly very much key, and I think we should really make use out of the technologies and also the digitization opportunities that we have here. And I'm just thinking about blockchain technologies and creating also visibility where the permanent magnets are standing. I think it's much about You cannot hear me?
I was somehow muted for a second. So just recap the last notion you had there.
Okay, no, I was just, also to the risk that I repeat myself, I was highlighting that it's very important in the permanent magnets market that we are using all the technologies we have, so also blockchain technology, to track the return of permanent magnets. I think the biggest issue here is when we are looking at recycling rate of below 1% in this market segment, that we are closing material loops, make absolutely sure that those materials stay in Europe, similar as it is also for the electronic vehicles now in the next generation. Today, when you're looking at the life cycle of a car, it has 4 life cycles, the first in Europe, the second in Southeast Europe, the third one maybe somewhere in Russia, and then it goes to Africa. But for the new generation of the electronic vehicles, we want to have 1 life cycle, and therefore we need to really also close material loops here using the right technologies. And I think that everything we're discussing here also on the battery passport and on the battery life cycle prediction makes all sense to me also for the rare earth permanent magnets market, as only this way we can guarantee the second life of those very precious raw materials that we do not have in Europe, regardless what we are doing now in order to invest. That will take time. So therefore, looking at the ramp up of the electronic vehicles market for the next years, there's a huge potential in order to capture those materials domestically in Europe.
I'm turning to my colleague Maria to see if there's any comments coming in on Slido, but I think not at the moment, right? So we can carry on the conversation amongst ourselves. We've got 9 minutes to run, but if there are any questions from the people tuning in online, don't hesitate to post them up, and we will ask them to our panel here. So next question I'm going to ask is, how do you think that the sort of the traceability can help us not just in reassuring customers, but in improving things in terms of performance, improving life cycle management of batteries? Diego, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, 2 answers. First, on what Chris answered, and also Michael, on the size of and you also your question on the size of what we need to measure. If I take the 32 gigawatt hours production capacity of the Gigafactory I was mentioning before, and you have to qualify each cell with 1 data, that will consume so much energy to store the data. So afterwards, somebody can look at it. If you have to store 2 data per cell, 3 data per cell, it means trillions of cells per year. So let's be mindful that traceability is based on data collection and is data storage. And the energy that we will consume up there north in Sweden, just to store the data we are collecting from every single cell that is coming out of the production line, is 15% of the total energy consumption of the factory production itself. So let's be mindful about what we want and wish for, because the impacts are monstrous. Okay.
Yeah, it's a proportionality thing, isn't it?
Totally. But again, the product is a cell. It's not the pack. It's not the battery. It's a cell. And if you go down to the cell, then you will multiply by trillions. And this data is data centers, boom, and then you go completely bizarre.
Yeah. Miriam, I've left you out of the conversation for a little bit. What strikes you as the most difficult part of introducing traceability for the lithium value chain, or any other part of the battery raw materials value chain?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, it's about whether the market would reward for it, because it comes at a cost for producers, and some of the mine producer upstream that are not maybe as well capitalized or a consequential size. So it's a matter not only of educating, informing, and getting up to speed technologically, but also a means. Investment means. So as Chris touched upon earlier, whether it's going to be paid for by the market as a premium over other products remains to be seen. This is not a given. And whether a regulatory push will help, yes, but it also removes liquidity from the market and options to service the customers. So it's the right balance to strike, I think. This is difficult. This is a difficult conundrum. Also, as Diego pointed out, on the number of data points to collect, because you can declare, you can certify, audit, or all of the above and verify. So how do you do all that without storing too much data and being an energy consumer and defeating the purpose in the end? So that's also to be thought of carefully.
So I'm going to be a bit heretical here. I mean, we talk about everything's got to be digitally tracked and traced, and as Diego has said, that means bytes stored on a server somewhere which is using raw materials and energy. What's wrong with good old paper and official stamp? It's worked for centuries. Anyone want to defend the old-fashioned method of traceability?
Not me.
Well, I mean, my comments would be in the commodity sector, the paper and pen approach works in tandem with the digital approach. So maybe you have to do away with one, and it's probably the pen and paper one.
But you also have other ways of keeping track of things. You can do it chemically as well in the case of certain products, right? Absolutely. Or engraving products, things like diamonds. So it's not necessarily always a question of going down the blockchain option, is it?
No. I mean, an easy sort of intermediate is just RFID chips and all these sort of things. Blockchain, I mean, I don't know enough about it to comment on it, but I give the same warning as before. Every new initiative adds a layer of burden to participants in the battery supply chain. So a lot of initiatives add a lot of layers of burden, and I think it's important not to burden the industry too much, yet keep, of course, transparency and robustness of this transparency at the very forefront.
Okay, no, I hope you know how these kind of sessions go, because when you're down to the last 3 minutes, the moderator is obviously going to say you've got 30 seconds to pass one key takeaway message. So each of you has that opportunity, and I'm going to ask Yves to go first. One takeaway message about the importance of traceability in developing responsible battery supply chains.
Well, I think all the actors of the battery supply chain needs to come together and have a dialogue and come up with an agreement there of what needs to happen there as far as traceability there.
Okay, good. Bernd?
Well, at the moment, we have a large number of voluntary standards, including benchmarking and performance standards, but no single traceability mechanism that covers the entire battery supply chain, and a fit-for-purpose solution that could be easily adapted by all is needed.
Thank you. Miriam?
No, I'd say don't lose your end goal from sight. Don't defeat your own purpose, yeah.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to what you're tracing and how you're going to do it, that you don't, exactly as we've talked about today, burn the industry, and it keeps moving very quickly.
All right, Michael?
I think I'll just echo what was said previously. Let's collaborate and onward and upwards.
Onward and upwards. Diego?
Well, we are in a new industry, so let's trace without killing the end purpose, as Miriam was saying. But it's new, so let's start with the right fundamentals.
Okay, right. I think I gave everyone the floor, right? I haven't missed anybody out. So I think we can more or less wrap up with that. I would like to thank Miriam, Michael, Yves, Chris, Bernd, and Diego, as well as Maria in my team here for preparing this session, for our colleagues on the Canadian side, and for all the unsung heroes who are doing all the logistics behind the scenes. So with that, I'd like to thank you all and wish you a good evening / rest of the day. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you to all. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.